else to talk about? Hello friends, Garrett Baird here, Sony Artisan of Imagery, and I'm going to show you 5 things today you need to know about the a7S III to get started creating. Thank you Sony Education for sponsoring this episode. Please make sure and check out their website in the link below. Alright, so the first thing that I get asked a lot is on the S3, which picture profile is the best, quote unquote the best. So in lieu of saying the best, I'm going to say the one that I use the most is called s-log3. And that is going to be, I think, PP8 on your picture profile settings. S-log3, don't be scared of it because a lot of people look at it and it's so flat. They're like, hey, I'm not a colorist. There's no way that I'll be able to color that and make it look natural. I don't know what I'm doing, which I started that way too. I did not want anything to do with S-Log for a long, long time. But now with the advent of the 10-bit inside of the S3, it's a miracle worker and you're going to absolutely love it. There are many LUTs available online. I would suggest looking at some of Sony's LUTs that they have that you can apply to your footage and, you know, maybe not give it the 100% of the LUT, maybe back it off just a little bit, kind of play with it and see where you're at with that. Where it gets tricky sometimes, if you go online and type free LUTs, you're going to get a lot of LUTs from people trying to sell you other LUTs. We've said LUTs like way too many times, but you're going to get a lot of different settings, different LUTs, and some of these LUTs require the IRE exposure setting to be either higher or lower, so you really don't know where you're at with that. So start basic, start simple, just go with some authentic Sony LUTs, and that's going to get you a really good start with S-Log3. If you ever have any questions about the picture profiles, like which one does what should I use this for, what does it actually do, what's the gamma on it, and all that sort of thing, all that information can be found at Sony's website. I'll put a link in the description, but it's very helpful and lots of good information. One thing that's really going to help you when you're shooting S-Log is an option called Gamma Display Assist. You want to turn this on. There's 3 options, off, on, and auto. Auto will just detect what picture profile you're using and apply it, or on, it'll just leave it on all of them. So you probably want to put it on auto, that way you don't accidentally use it while you're on like picture profile off, or maybe you're on Cinetone, something like that. And what this is going to do is going to give you a contrasty, heavily saturated, kind of what's called a Rec. 709 look. So it's going to look more finished and it's easier to see on the screen, first of all, because when you're shooting S-Log3, it's really, you know, if you're out in the bright sun, sometimes it's such a flat image with no contrast, it's kind of hard to see, am I in focus? Am I overexposed? Where am I at on that? So the Gamma Display Assist will definitely help you when you're shooting S-Log3. Another very popular picture profile is called S-Cinetone. You are going to sacrifice a little bit of that dynamic range with that, but it's really good if you're in a situation where you have to deliver the image very quickly, the video has to get out, maybe like we have what's called a same-day edit for our weddings, so that would be a perfect example where I could use that and straight out of the camera, it has a very nice and clean kind of cinema look to it. I don't have to worry about even applying a LUT. I just throw it on the timeline, start editing, and it's good to go. Now let's talk about focusing. For a very long time, I was in the camp of, you know what, you're not a real cinematographer, filmmaker / videographer, whatever you want to call it, unless you use manual focus, because I had used it for so many years. And slowly but surely, Sony turned me over to, let's say, the dark side of autofocusing. And now I use autofocus. Probably over 90% of all of my work is autofocusing because they've gotten so good at it that it just makes my job so much easier. And why wouldn't you want your job to be easier? Now you're going to open up your focus settings and you're going to be blown away with how many options there are. There are so many options. The first thing you want to do is go into your menu and go down to the focus tab. It says AF/MF on it. And you're going to go to the right and there's a little option number 3 says Face Eye AF. You're going to go over one more time and you're going to see an option down here called Eye Frame Display. Now, unless they've changed it, this option is off by default. You want to make sure that's turned on. This is going to show you a display of around the person you're shooting, whether it be their eye or face, showing you that it has locked onto their face. I don't know why this is off by default, because the face and eye focus still works. It just doesn't have that nice little box around your face to show that, hey, it's actually grabbing a hold of that face. So make sure and turn that on, and not to be confused that it's not working. When I'm running and gunning out in the field, I tend not to use the wide autofocus. I like to use what's called a zone. And what it does, it looks like it's a box about the size of a third of the screen or so, and you can move that around the screen and change your zone. Now, if you want to get even more control over it, there is an expanded flexible spot that I like using that's very small, and you can move that around. So if you're trying to, shoot between people, or maybe you're trying to shoot between these two objects or things like that, you can really narrow down where you want the camera to look and focus on. There are two additional settings you need to play around with and get accustomed to and get a feel for when you are trying to use your autofocusing system. The first one tells the camera how quickly you want the lens to focus between subject 1, subject 2, foreground, background. You can have if you're doing sports and everybody's moving around, you can make it very quick. That way it hops from one person to the other. That's not very organic or very film-like looking. So if you were shooting a wedding, for instance, and you wanted to, pull focus from the bride to her dad in the background crying, something like that, if you have it set to fast, it's going to go wham, it's going to go right to the other person and just pull people totally out of what they're viewing. So you can adjust that so it's super slow and it's more of a organic. It almost feels like an organic human pulling the focus. And you can go really slow. I think there's like 7 different settings. So just play around with that. That's going to come in really handy depending on your subject material that you're shooting. The other one that you should really get to know is called subject shift sensitivity. What this is going to do is adjust how sensitive the autofocus tracking system is from jumping from one subject to another. So let's say you're shooting a basketball game and the hero is getting ready to run down the court and you want to just lock on him. He has the ball. You don't want it to shift to another person. You want that to be locked on. So it's going to do as much as it can, work as hard as it can to keep that subject in focus and not jump to somebody else. So yeah, play with those settings and that's going to really help you dial in your autofocus system. It does take a little bit of time just to get used to it, but once you get it, you'll get it, your camera will get it, and your job will be so much easier not having to pull focus manually and be tack sharp every time. Next, let's talk about the file format you're going to choose. I personally use the option a7sIII all intra 4K. It's going to go through your memory card. It's quick, but it's going to give you the absolutely best image possible from your S3. Now, if you don't have a lot of memory and you really want to conserve space, you can choose the a7sIII HS 4K. This is a much higher compressed video file, and you're going to save a lot of space, but it's going to be a little harder to work with in post-production. Your Final Cut Pro, Premiere, whatever you're using, is going to have a harder time to edit it and code it and all that, so you may want to make a proxy or re-encode it before you start editing it, but it will save you a lot of space on memory cards. When it comes to memory, I would suggest using the fastest card you can afford. This camera really needs a lot of bandwidth to get some of these images and the video onto the card, especially when you're shooting that all-eye. You don't have to have a CF Express Type A to use this camera. In fact, I only have one of them right now because the majority of what I shoot, I don't need that extra bandwidth. For now, don't worry about the CF Express Type A cards. You really don't need them to start off with. There's only one thing you cannot shoot with the CF Express Type A, and that's the 120 frames per second all-eye format. You can still shoot 120 frames per second, just not in the all-eye option. Whatever SD card you get for your camera, just don't cheap out. This is something I see a lot of. People will spend, $3,000 or more on a camera and then find the cheapest, absolute cheapest memory cards they can find, and they wonder why they're having problems and why maybe they're dropping frames or it'll just stop recording or things like that. Don't cheap out on your memory. Whatever one you get, just go with a trusted brand. Look at the reviews. I personally use Sony's Tough cards. These things are absolutely beast. I love these cards. I love how they sound when you drop them. I don't suggest dropping them, but they're waterproof, they're drop proof, they're metal, they feel like quality. And so far, knock on wood, I haven't had an issue with them yet. So even if you don't buy Sony, just please make sure and get a top quality fast card for your new a7S III. Let's talk about stabilization for a minute. Sony has really upped their game with the in-body stabilization. They haven't improved on the IBIS built into the camera, but they've added something to that, and when you put those together, they work really well, and that's the active stabilizer. When you turn on the active stabilization, you're going to get a 1.1 times crop factor. Now, that's not the end of the world. It's only 10%, and for what you're getting, sacrificing that 10% of your frame, it's a no-brainer because you're getting a much smoother shot than you would not having that. So you really aren't losing anything. And plus, you can even take it even further into your editing software and stabilize it a bit more to really get a nice and smooth shot. Again, though, keep in mind that does not replace your gimbal. This is like a handheld situation where you're maybe not walking as much. You don't want to try to do like big movements that you would normally do with the gimbal with your hand, but you're walking around, trying to do nice and soft movements and organic shots. It really helps clean all that up and make it more viewable. Now, if you really want to go handheld and you don't want to worry about the in-body stabilization system, Sony has also introduced into the camera a gyro system stabilizer. So what that means is if you ever have your phone, there's a game, you hold your phone up and you can tilt the phone, to turn different directions, things like that. It has that same kind of sensor built into the camera. So as you're shooting handheld and you're moving the camera around like this and doing all kinds of crazy things, it's recording the motion and movement of the camera. Then later in post, you can use that information that the camera has collected with the gyro sensor using their Catalyst browse software, and you can stabilize that with much greater results than trying to stabilize it in your editing software. Two things to note if you're planning on using that gyro stabilization system in post-production to stabilize everything. The first being you must turn off all of your stabilization in camera. So that means if you're using a stabilized lens, you got to turn it off. If you're using in-body stabilization, you got to turn it off. You have nothing like that running on your camera. Everything must be done in post. Secondly, you're going to have to raise your shutter speed. You can't have any motion blur on your footage if you're trying to use that stabilization gyro data in post with the software. What's going to happen if you have motion blur is the motion blur will be going one direction and the stabilization may be going a different direction, and it's going to give some real off-putting results. One thing that I don't want to be doing when I'm out shooting is digging through menus. And Sony has given us so many options with these cameras that there is an unlimited amount of variables that you can put together, and there's a menu for everything. So I don't want to be going through those while I'm out shooting. Sony has listened to us, and a long time ago they gave us what's called the quick function menu. Now this menu is crucial for me because this lets me at the touch of a button pull up 12 different settings that I can change very quickly while I'm shooting and go back to shooting without having to dig through a bunch of menus. Now, if 12 options on the quick function menu isn't enough, they do have another option in the menu called My Menu. And in that one, you can add quite a few more, so you can use some of the ones you use the most of and go right to that top setting and get it and then go back to shooting. When using this camera, keep in mind, Sony has given us the ability to customize this to whatever we want it to be. Quite frankly, if I grabbed a camera off the shelf right now, I would have a hard time using it because I have all of these buttons programmed to many different things that aren't what they might be intended for. For instance, I like to be able to punch in to check my focus, and I've programmed the AF on button simply because it has a little magnifying glass to it, and I can use that when I'm shooting video to punch in and check my focus, and I'm good to go. Along with all of these buttons that are customizable on your camera, something that I find very useful to go even a step further, because again, I don't want to go into my menu system. I want to stay outside of the camera and I want to use the buttons that are there to give me quick access to what I need, is called the My Dial settings. You want to open your menu and go all the way down to where it says Setup, and then you're going to go over to Dial Customize, then go over to My Dial Settings. Now in there you get to choose which wheel you want to use to dial in your settings. The one I use the most of is to change my white balance Kelvin. So we're going to go up here and we're going to change that to white balance C temp, which means custom temperature. Click that, and then we're going to OK, get out of there. But now we have to go to back in the setup settings and operation customize. Then we're going to go over to the video portion here and custom key setting. For this, I changed number 4, which is C1. I changed that to my dial 1 during hold. Click that. OK. So what we just did is set it up so that we can do an ultra-fast white balance change without having to go into any menu. You simply hold down on C1 and spin that front wheel. What's really cool about this is, let's say you had the front wheel set to your aperture. Well, by holding your custom 1 button and spinning the wheel now, it's going to be your white balance. Let go of the button and you're back to your aperture. It's just a really cool and fast way to change a setting. And you can do that with many other settings so that you can stay out here on your camera in the world creating and not digging in menus. I absolutely love it. If you're like me and you have to wear glasses, contacts just don't work for me, I have to have glasses, there is an option that Sony has made just for us. It's so crazy. I didn't even know about this till I stumbled across it here a while back. So if you're using the viewfinder, which I do quite often, I'm outside and I just don't want to trust my screen. I want to lock in on the back of that electronic viewfinder, which is just a brilliant display. You can actually make it a little smaller. And what that does is, like, if you don't have that on, when I put my eye up to it with my glasses on, I can't see the entire viewfinder. So if we go into this setting, in your menu, it's the little yellow tab way down at the bottom called Setup. I want to go over into that, and then there's an option called Finder Monitor. Hit the right direction again, and you're going to go into Viewfinder Magnification. And when you change that from standard to zoom out, what that's going to do is literally zoom you away from the monitor a little bit, so you're going to be able to see the entire monitor if you wear glasses. Unlike before, if I put my face up to it, there were still some edges that were cut off a little bit that I couldn't quite see, that I'd have to angle my head around. This way it kind of pops in a little bit, and like I said, you lose a little bit of resolution, but it's not that bad, and it really helps me when I'm shooting in the field using my electronic viewfinder. All right, let's move on and talk about the ISO settings. Now, Sony doesn't officially come out and say the a7S III is a dual ISO camera, but for all intents and purposes, it really is. Now, what that means is those 2 base ISOs are going to give you the least amount of noise in your footage. Typically, I like to stay as close to 640 and 12,800 as I can. Those are the 2 native ISOs for S-Log3. Now, that doesn't mean I will go up a little bit, but what you don't want to do is, like, for instance, shoot at 10,000 ISO. If you shoot at 10,000 ISO, that's going to be really, really noisy. You click that up one to 12,800, and all of that clears up and gives you a beautiful, clean image. Keep in mind, each picture profile is going to have a different base dual ISO. So you want to research that and make sure you find out what that is on what picture profile you're using. But for S-Log3, it's 640, 12,800. Well, I think I've given you more than 5 tips with this camera, but I hope you found at least 1 or 2 tidbits of wisdom in there that you can use to create amazing and beautiful content in your future. Thanks so much for your time, and I really hope you have an amazing day. Thanks.